Before that, she was a research fellow in Queen's University Belfast and director of research in Comharn Sustainable Development Council. So welcome you all, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Diana. It's really great to be with you all today. So good afternoon to everybody, or at least it's afternoon here in the UK, so where people are around the world, but hope you're all well. So this session is going to run for 90 minutes, so it's until 17:15 GMT. As Diana said, I'm Gary Cass. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientist in Natural England and a visiting professor at the University of Surrey in the Centre for Environment and Sustainability. What we'll be doing briefly, I was just going to give a brief outline of what we'll be doing in the session and then hand on to Tom. So we're going to be sharing and hopefully extending some key insights that we set out in a paper that we published in Environmental Science and Policy in December. And Tom will give an outline for that very, very shortly. We'll go into some breakout groups to explore some of the enablers and barriers in each of the three kind of key areas, the elements of these knowledge architecture transitions that we're talking about, and hopefully be able to highlight some case studies that we're familiar with. We will try and record as much of this as we can. Unfortunately, the Zoom account allows us only to record the plenary, but we will capture the chat in each of the workshops, and obviously we'll be taking notes. And then we will come back to plenary to share those discussions and then kind of add any more insights that emerge from the three groups. And then we'll pass to Kathy from the European Environment Agency. We'll talk about next steps, particularly in work that she's taking forward within the agency. So I think on that note, I will pass quickly to Tom to kick us off. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Diana, for the introductions. So yeah, I'll jump right in. Gary's kind of mentioned that this paper, which we'll be exploring these ideas from today. Just to set this in the bigger context, well, and firstly, just thank everyone for joining as well, and hopefully allowing us to kind of crowdsource your knowledge to help extend this work. To set this in context, we're all aware, I'm sure, of these accelerating socioeconomic trends, whether it's population size or energy use or water use. And these are interacting and compounding with each other to drive these changes in Earth system trends, whether that's driving climate change or biodiversity loss. And looking forwards, many of these different socioeconomic drivers, whether it's population size, technological change, geopolitical shifts, are interacting to create risks. So shown here in the COGS, this is work from the EEA and their recent Drivers of Change report, and how these socioeconomic changes are interacting with each other to drive, in this case, these environmental systemic risks. And the colours here reflect how they impact human health or opportunities for future generations or food security. So really these, long-term trends creating this very high-risk situation for society. That's of course led to many calls for systemic transformation. These science policy reports relate to the food system, but equally there are calls for transformation of mobility systems and energy systems, and just more generally, really a step change in how we live our lives in terms of how we travel, what we buy, to really meet what's needed to, for example, reduce climate change. Just to give you an idea of the level of change we need to meet the 1.5 degree global warming target, we need a 7.6 reduction in emissions every year from now on. Just for reference, the COVID-19 lockdowns caused a 6.4% drop in that year. So you can see the magnitude of change that we need, and that's concurrent with measures to reverse this quite dramatic decline in biodiversity as well, along with other environmental pressures. So we really do face a challenge as a society. Traditionally, providing knowledge for supporting the policy process. Here's one way of looking at that, capturing the monitoring and data elements, feeding into information and assessments which provide knowledge to support the policy process. as an example, in the UK, we had the Natural Capital Committee. This was 10 years, a committee informing the government. And that's led more recently to highlighting that there are big data deficits and monitoring deficits. So we have a £10 million programme for monitoring natural capital. Now that's great because there are genuine gaps around monitoring and data, but equally we felt there was a real lack, and other researchers as well, and this jump between knowledge and decision making, and this right hand side of the chain needs a bit more focus. Just to give an example of a question here, how should we transform a local landscape to deliver multiple socially desirable objectives? So this is things like reducing, ensuring flood protection, clean air, areas in the landscape for recreation, for improving mental health. So we can use data and models to inform on this to some degree. In addition to just providing the data, there's this important process of validation and then really work needed about how those models are effectively applied. So many of you might be familiar with ecosystem service models. So, these are held in different sectors. So some in academia, some in government, some in NGOs. But these are models, for example, to make a prediction of how you might change a land use, how that would affect recreational value, how would it affect flood protection, how would it affect how much carbon is stored in that landscape. So there's obviously a need to bring these different actors together to provide some kind of platform, integrating this spatial modeling to provide decision support tools. And actually those models do need better validation. At the moment, in terms of the field, it's not like climate science where there's been a rigorous development of modeling and validation. In ecosystem service modeling, we're still in the early days, and so a lot more thought about model validation. But in addition to that, there's a need to think about the stakeholders, not just the modelers and the policymakers, but also civil society groups and citizens who these decisions impact. So the reason why is that the societal objectives that these decisions are aiming to address are by no means clear. That there's plurality of views and values around what those objectives should be. So they're contested, and there needs to be a consensus building approach around defining those objectives. And that's important for ensuring democratic accountability of those decisions. If we don't do that, we get problems. This is an example from the Gilets jaunes protests in France. Arguably a progressive policy in the sense of putting taxes on fossil fuels, petrol, to address climate change, but equally people weren't effectively consulted, and that led to these big protests and lots of violent protests as well. Another example in the UK was in 2010, it was proposed to change the ownership of the Crown Forest estate. But actually people weren't really consulted effectively. There was a big public outcry, and the government had a kind of humiliating back down and had to reverse that decision. That was just about changing the ownership of the forests. With net zero, recent calculations in the UK reckon that we need to transform about an area of land use around 2 times the size of Wales. So that will change land use from agriculture to bioenergy crops, or agriculture to woodland. So these are huge changes that are going to affect people's livelihoods. They're going to affect the way landscapes look, the kind of cultural history of those landscapes. So really, you need to involve people in those decisions because it's affecting their livelihoods. And of course, that's been raised, this need for a greater level of democracy in our democracies has been raised by groups like Extinction Rebellion. And to some degree, Parliament in the UK, for example, have had a climate assembly, but not yet a government. But in other countries like France, there's been a climate assembly process, which has been quite successful. So things are moving in the right direction, perhaps, but they're still quite niche, many of these examples. So in addition to the integrated spatial modeling that I mentioned, bringing together those different modeling groups and providing a platform, there's a need to also integrate civil society into those decisions by local government and national government, and the evidence provision by, for example, academia. And that's important, as I mentioned, providing democratic legitimacy of those decisions. Another reason is many of the models have normative assumptions. So, how much we value something in the future versus now, how much we value and put aside for future generations is a normative question. The discounting rate used in economic calculations. Equally, which aspects of biodiversity do we care about, and how do we measure it? So these normative assumptions should be open to criticism, shouldn't be made by modelers in ivory towers. Some other benefits are understanding public attitudes and what is politically possible for these decisions, for these transformations, and better coordination of polycentric governance. So if we're trying to create these transformations, it can't just be done in a top-down way through regulation or getting the prices right. We really need different groups, different businesses, civil society groups to be pulling in the same direction. So developing that shared vision and acting on it. So engaging people in these processes to get the agency needed to pull in the right direction is also brought about by this much more participatory approach. So this is quite a complex slide, but I've talked a lot about people's values, and the slide, the figure here on the left is a kind of one-shot summary of systems thinking. It's actually, systems thinking comes from a lot of diverse different fields, but essentially it's trying to understand environmental, social systems, economic systems. Crucially though, it's not just understanding them in an objective way, it's taking into account the plurality and understandings of different stakeholders. So understanding their purposes, their values, helping them to set the boundary judgments on these decisions and how we frame a problem. So in addition to statistical, process-based, agent-based modelings, all these things that might be involved in systems modelling, there's also a whole raft of methods from the systems social sciences around evidence synthesis, and in particular transdisciplinary participatory approaches, something that I've just mentioned about involving people in framing a problem, thinking about the solution spaces. On the right-hand side is organisational wisdom. This is a whole set of other disciplines that kind of come together in this confluence of academia coming under wisdom studies, and sometimes called institutional wisdom. But you can see here some of the points around making sophisticated and sensitive use of knowledge, using judgment that accommodates multiple realities, weighs the interest of multiple stakeholders. This is very similar to systems thinking, taking into account wider social ethical considerations and exercising wisdom in decision-making. So whichever of these fields we're looking at, there's strong focus on involving citizens understanding their values, but the competencies needed in either developing wisdom in leadership, but also in institutional protocols, so wise decisions can be made, and also developing systems thinking in government and trying to build competencies in these areas. When I've talked about sustainability transitions, and it might be useful to think about these in different phases, and envisioning, implementing and evaluating phase that are interlinked. And actually, all these phases involve some element of participatory processes. So developing a shared vision, how that vision is implemented, involving different actors needing to pull in the same direction. And also in the evaluation that can also feed back into refining the initial vision. Note here that there's new indicators needed of sustainability transitions as well, in addition to our current set of indicators of environmental change. This whole process actually needs to be thought about in a kind of hierarchical sense, because at the sort of supranational level, we can have visions and think about living well within the limits of our planet, the kind of motto of the European Commission action programme. What is living well and what are the key elements of that? That discussion that's needed, that participatory approach and deliberation around what is living well within the limits of the planet. But equally at the national level and at the regional level, how do we want our individual landscapes to look? And you can imagine there needs to be interplay between these levels, because if we change landscapes to have more or less woodland, for example, those need to sum up to meet our national targets for sequestering carbon, to meet our international commitments on climate change. So there needs to be dialogue up and down and these vertical coherence as well. And really, I'm just going to touch now on this last element of adaptive governance and organisational learning, because this evaluating part is crucial to feed back in a dynamic way into the envisioning and evaluating phases. These are complex systems, and we're certainly not going to get it right first time, and they're very difficult to anticipate almost by definition. So there needs to be an adaptive governance approach, and that needs to be beyond what's called single loop learning, of simply adjusting our policies in response to the changing environment. There can be deeper changes, where an organization can adapt its learning processes by changing the organizational norms and assumptions. And even, critical explorations of different ways of sense making, questioning core purposes of our institutions and how we know what is best. So sometimes called triple loop learning. So I've kind of whizzed through this, and I encourage you to look at the paper in due course if you want more explanation of some of these different elements. But generally it's moving away from this linear process of knowledge provision to support decisions, to thinking about the wisdom, wise decision making to make actions, and learning from those actions in a kind of more iterative way. I should say, actually, this piece of work fits in a much broader set of work that Kathy will probably mention at the end around knowledge for action as the European Environment Agency developments. But the three elements that I want to I've talked about today, and that we're going to focus on in the workshop, institutional reform towards wisdom and systems literacy. So building those competencies to make this jump between knowledge and wise decisions. Taking action in a way that involves people. So that means mainstream participatory approaches. There are some nice examples, but how do we end up with where every region can have the infrastructure to get people together with the evidence to think about how their local landscape should look like, for example. So that capacity for transdisciplinary and implementation research at the moment is lacking, because research councils fund primary science often. Government has some ability to commission research, but I mean, in the UK, as an example, it's gone down about 90% in the last decade. So there's a big area in the middle about applied research that is poorly funded. But if we want to transition a step change in the way our societies work, we need this type of transdisciplinary research to be very well funded and widely replicated across regions, feeding up those hierarchical scales to national and supranational scales. And then really the learning element, learning from those actions, learning by doing. And so these two elements are grouped together. So there are 5 points, but I've grouped them into 3 here, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Just to wrap up the presentation, sustainability transitions, we need to transform our societies, but they won't be achieved with simply more or better data. They need the right knowledge architecture. So I'm talking about types of knowledge, processes of knowledge brokering, and the competencies of use of that knowledge in decision making. And that's going to be disruptive, but those reforms are likely to be needed if we want those sustainability transitions to be successful. So really, the exam question for today that we're hoping we can kind of pick your brains and really get your insights on this is how best to catalyze these types of reforms that we've outlined. So we've got these 3 broad elements of reform, of knowledge architecture, that we're going to deal with in turn in the breakout groups. And what we're asking really, and the facilitator of each group will be able to explain a little bit more, but we're going to try and identify any enablers and barriers from your perspectives, any case studies of good or bad practice. And then crucially as well, this is a set of people that came together drawing on their experiences at the science policy interface, but there may be other elements that we're missing that don't really fall neatly into this framework. And if that's the case, there'll be time to flag those. And this will feed on to, as Kathy will mention, ongoing work that the EEA are doing. So I'm going to stop there because we want more time really for the workshop element. And I'm going to ask Francisco if he's able to initiate the breakout groups. So what will happen now, there'll be Kathy, myself and Gary will be one of the facilitators. You'll get an invite to join a breakout group. And if you can accept that, and then we shall continue the activity in those groups. And then we'll come back into the main room at the end. And Gary will chair a synthesis to draw some conclusions together, and Kathy will finish up. So thanks from me, and I'll hand over to the breakout groups now.
Okay, are we staying with 45 minutes to breakout room?
well, we will reconvene at 4:55, so it's just under 45 minutes, isn't it? Sorry.
Well, I set an amount of time, so do you want to reconvene at 1:45 or keep the original 45 minutes planned?
Well, if we can reconvene at 4:55, please. If you're able to calculate that, it's
yeah, sure. Thank you.
That because I've come in directly on Zoom. If I put my email address on the chat and then you send it to me there, that would be amazing.
Sorry, Heather, we got cut off at the last minute, didn't we? But
there we go.
I got the point down on paper. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Tom, just to say, Imogen has absolutely saved the day for me because I forgot to save the chat, but she did. So it's amazing.
Oh, good. That's good. I thought it'd be me who forgot. That's why I had to remind myself in several ways. But yeah, well, sounds like she saved the day. Thank you.
Definitely. No, huge thanks for that. Right. Hopefully everybody's back. We might have had a few dropouts, but we've got to press on, I think. So hopefully you had as rich and as frustratingly short conversations as we managed in our group. We could have spent at least the whole time speaking about each of the three sections. The way that we're going to run this feedback session is that each of us is going to start by feeding back on a particular area. So if we start with Kathy focusing on participation, and then Tom and I will add to that, and then Tom will talk about the systems thinking area, and we'll all add to that, and then I'll focus on the learning, and others will add to that. So hopefully that will work as a process. So Kathy, over to you.
Yes, I will start. Well, actually, one of the things is that we were a small group, so we ended up not doing quite a lot in the chat, and instead just having a chat and talking amongst ourselves. So I hope that I captured enough of that, that I do justice to the conversation. So in this first one, really about how we can best catalyze mainstreaming and participatory approaches and more transdisciplinary and implementation research, I think it was easier, as it always is, to talk about barriers rather than enablers. So some of the things that people put forward were things like the incentive structures and stuff in academia, kind of the disciplinary culture and silo mentality that we still have, but also things like you have very different perceptions of participation and what that means, and then how you can share information amongst different sets of actors. Other things that we're seeing as barriers were things like, trust really, and complexity, and these really you need time to build trust, especially if you're into what you're doing is a bit more experimental, and you may have some attempts that don't quite succeed with what you're doing. And that means, one of the things that you have to do really is embrace failure and keep going. And I guess this attitude of doing that becomes an enabler as well. So they were the key points that really came from our first discussion on this.
Excellent. No, that's really, really helpful. I think there's some familiar thoughts in there. Tom, anything from your group to add to that?
Not so much. We got to this one right at the end, so we had less time. But one of the points was about that participatory processes, to be kind of more widely effective and adopted, need to be kind of shown to be effectively influencing the policy process and leading towards transition. So initiatives like the Citizen Assembly UK that was developed by Parliament, which is not government, it is obviously less effective than something that is the French one, which I gather is more part of the governance process. And then there was a point about funding and providing funding, for example, to implement the SDGs, as opposed to kind of, I suppose, more siloed funding into sort of government departments for sort of traditional objectives, which are much more sort of fragmented. But yeah, I think that was mainly the points we made on that last one.
All right, no, thank you for that. From our group, and please jump in, anyone from my group, that we started with this one, so maybe we spent longer on this. And one of the things that really jumped out for us was just about the time, and a real barrier being the mismatch in expectations around, and indeed capacity around, being able to take the time to do this in an iterative way. Thinking about how we approach experiments, how we approach evaluation, needing to agree those kind of approaches, really helping particularly people outside of academia, policymakers and others, to really create the time and space that enable them to do that. Really isn't easy, and even if it is recognized even by the sort of partners as being important, I think there is also a key element there about preconceptions, actually, and expectations, which again I think you kind of alluded to on that, and really about the sort of question around inclusion, and about who do we include in terms of citizens and stakeholders, and also recognize that researchers themselves are citizens and stakeholders themselves, so they need to bring a plurality of perspectives themselves into this, and also recognize really that some of the diagnoses and prospectives that we need to do in this process is not something that researchers are necessarily trained to do. So we need to be able to bring capability in to help do that and build that. So that's where we got to as far as kind of learning was concerned. I'll just add very, very briefly to that, and something I've spoken about in other forums, is that quite often when the academy is investing in transdisciplinary capability, it forgets to invest in the capability of those that they wish to be transdisciplinary with. So they kind of invest in building researchers' skills in transdisciplinarity, but actually don't really build capability in policy spheres or industry spheres or civil society spheres to be able to participate in those kind of processes as well. So there has to kind of be a symmetry in that. Okay. That's very helpful. Tom, do you want to kick us off on the systems thinking feedback then? Yeah.
So in terms of systems thinking, we had some, we talked about academia initially, and the departmental structures of universities don't necessarily facilitate this, the sort of traditional, life sciences, business departments, etc. The incentives, again, in terms of promotion of tenure, an enabler might be kind of recognition of groups rather than individuals, and also obviously more of a focus on impact rather than applied impact from the work. Maybe long-term contracts rather than having sort of postdocs jump in between different positions, and fellowships between in government from academia and vice versa as well, from government into academia. And also there were some case studies of transdisciplinary funding opportunities, like the Belmont Forum was one example. And then a final constraint was about whether systems thinking was not being established well, for example, in government either. And some case studies there, I suppose. Well, one example that I'm familiar with is in the DEFRA, we had a systems research program, which was trying to develop systems thinking competencies, and Gary was involved in that. But that also faced constraints in terms of just being kind of in itself a bit siloed, and how do you then reach across government departments? So yeah, that was our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Kathy, anything to add?
I mean, we had kind of a similar discussion, but also the recognition that if we're thinking about this, there are very many dimensions to address. So sometimes one initiative is really not enough to do that, whether you're looking at it from a policy perspective or changing something within an organization. And we heard some interesting case study of work that's been being done in the Catalonian government. So we could look at that a bit more and see what learning is from that. And then we also discussed a little bit about the EEA as a case study itself, and how we went from just saying there's a need to really apply systems thinking and develop knowledge to support sustainability transitions, to actually doing that ourselves, and how we did that. And one of the big enablers was really changing people's mindsets. So starting off by actually getting people to recognize the value and benefits of doing things in this way and what you can gain from it as well, and not just in terms of the type of knowledge that you produce, but also in terms of becoming more of a learning organisation and cultural change as well, and more participatory, and even just at a personal level, more reflective on your own kind of competences and abilities. So these were some of the things that we explored there.
Excellent. No, thank you for that. Yeah, we picked up similar kind of threads, but we also kind of recognised, as well as the need to be reflexive, is about the need to be flexible as well, and not be held to particular rigid frameworks. We kind of recognised some of the difficulties involved in overcoming some rather mythical or embedded theories and theories of change that people often work to, even in the face of very good evidence. But we kind of again recognised the need to try and inculcate the idea that theories of change kind of approaches, taking a systems kind of perspective, is a way to get going with something. It's not about trying to define it in all its glory to start with. And also felt that perhaps we needed to really embed the education for sustainable development agenda coming out of UNESCO, the key competencies for sustainability, within not just the academy, but within learning programs for all sorts of different institutions, really driving futurist literacy, reflexivity, systems thinking, anticipation. And we had examples, for instance, from Sussex University itself about sharing modules across different master's courses where that was being embedded. So that's where we got to on the institutional reform for wisdom and systems thinking literacy. And then the last one then is really then down to me to kick off. Oh no, I've done that one. Hang on.
Gary, I think Kathy started with participation, and then I think you put your learning bit on the end of that.
Oh yes, I did. Sorry, yes, I jumped in after that, didn't I? Sorry. So yeah, so we have covered everything, just not quite in the order we expected to. Okay.
But actually,
Kathy and I might have some to add to the learning part.
I have something to add to experimentation. Yeah, and learning.
Okay.
We didn't do ours.
All right.
Okay, Tom, do you want to go first?
No, sorry, you go first, Kathy, and I'll follow.
Okay, so some of the things that really our discussion focused a lot more on experimentation, really, rather than the whole broad range of issues that are within that title. And some of the real things that were identified as enablers was, being able to really try to navigate the different expectations of participants in these processes, and things like opening up spaces to enable this experimentation to happen, and also having goals of not trying to get consensus really, but shared understanding. So this kind of thing's about being clear and having these expectations. We heard a little bit of stuff about, there's a need to really be transparent and recognize there will be winners and losers in a lot of these things, and bring in the social dimension much more strongly than we often do, because when we're talking about sustainability transitions, often there's much more emphasis on the environmental dimension than the social dimension. So the need to really think about that. And then we also heard a very interesting case study really about from Kenya, which was about them taking this whole government approach. So when initiating projects, trying to bring in the whole of government from the outset, and their School of Government has some quite interesting case studies, which show that for this whole government approach, actually the cost of doing some of these things actually goes down than it does when you do them in a much more fragmented way. So as you know, people who may not really think there's merit in doing some of these things because of the sustainability outcome may actually think there's merit in doing these things because of an efficiency cost outcome. I guess it depends who you're talking to. So that would be some interesting case studies to look at to make the economic case for doing this, as well as a sustainability case or ethical case, etc. So That was what was different to yours, Gary.
Thank you.
In addition.
No, thank you.
Our group, we focused a little bit on academic sort of research and funding of research, and talked about the sort of acceptance of failure in research, that, you know, if you're doing this type of research, you know, by definition, things might not work in the way you expect, and that, you know, enabling that to be factored in. Also, the constraints around not having if it's genuinely transdisciplinary research, you don't have all the methods or the questions worked out up front, because the whole point is that you're doing that engagement initially to help you scope and frame the problem. So that can be an issue with sort of traditional funding modes. We talked about and examples of sort of case studies of good learning practice, talked about the climate kick initiatives, and some of the issues around barriers in communication with learning. We started to get onto a deeper question about sort of second and third order learning, about whether institutions have the capacity to kind of transform themselves, or whether, you know, they kind of, well, by the institutional inertia, that kind of means that their structures kind of remain very much in place. And what are the ways that you could facilitate that deeper questioning of the ways institutions work and the why behind them? So, you know, for example, the social contract between citizens and government, and how you can really open that to more debate and transform institutions. And one of the suggestions was more sort of open spaces, where those long-term open spaces, where those lessons can be shared. And also, I mean, that goes, I think, as well for the academia as well, rather than sort of short-term research projects, actually longer-term funding with less specific immediate deliverables, but allows that kind of learning process by the different sort of stakeholders involved. So, sorry, a bit of a funny order there, but that was the sort of additional points from our group.
Okay. Excellent. No, thank you for that. That's really, really, really helpful. Yeah, okay, we've got very little time left. I'm already conscious of going beyond that. So I'm going to kind of draw this bit to a close. We'll try and draw all that together and try and make some sense of everything. There's so much in there. I'm sure we haven't reflected anywhere near as much as we might have wanted to if we'd had longer. So I'm going to pass to Kathy now to give us a bit of insight as to where next for this, and her kind of ongoing initiative within the European Environment Agency. So thank you for your participation so far. Thank you.
Okay. So as Tom said, the original kind of this paper and the work that we've been doing originated in some seminars that we ran at the European Environment Agency with our scientific committee, of which Tom was a member. And in it, we were really looking, every 5 years, the European Environment Agency does a kind of a flagship assessment called the State and Outlook of the European Environment. And it directly supports strategic European policy in the form of the environment action programs, as well as thematic policy and things. And so in our last one in 2015, we talked about the need for sustainability transitions and the need for systemic change, particularly in our production and consumption systems. So since 2015, we've been developing our knowledge base in this whole area, looking at, and so our assessment in 2020 was really focused around transitions and transformative change, as well as the core business that we have to do across kind of the different environmental policy domains. So we published that, but obviously interacted with policymakers during the development of that. And then shortly after we published that, the European Commission published its European Green Deal, which was, if you look at it in the detail, certainly in terms of ambition, it's quite a change. It puts sustainability much more at the heart of European policymaking and has quite a strong transformation agenda. Now, of course, we need to see how this plays out in terms of implementation. So what we did was took our assessment, 2020 assessment, and then put it in the context of this new policy landscape to look at what the ambitions were, how did policy developments kind of respond to this need for systemic transformation. And we looked at the role of different enablers, including knowledge, and how knowledge can support action to achieve change. And we published this report in October last year. And one of the things that we did is that we used Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that or not. I guess it depends on your background. But he was the one who coined the term paradigm shift. And we looked at it and we said, well, if you look at how we understand environment sustainability challenges, how that has changed over the decades, we could say we've seen really a paradigm shift in understanding of this, to see environmental challenges as sustainability challenges as systemic, that we need to address all of these broad dimensions. Then we also thought, well, how has policy responded or evolved in this kind of way? And I mean, then if we begin to look at how policy has evolved over that time period, you could say arguably that we are in the middle of a paradigm shift in environmental policy from environment to sustainability. But then when we look at things in terms of knowledge, you don't necessarily see the same shift. And what you see is that, you know, we have a very established way of doing things, and that, you know, there have been a lot of very positive initiatives that are trying to complement what we're already doing with more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, more participatory approaches. But we have to ask the question, is that really enough? Will that get us a knowledge system that can provide the knowledge to support policy to affect change at the needed speed and scale? And so our question was, well, we don't think so. We think we need this similar paradigm shift in knowledge. And this is what we explore a bit in that report. We put down some first ideas about what a knowledge system for sustainability could look like. It builds on what we have in the paper as well, but it also, you know, brings in some other perspectives as well. So this is an area that we want to work on and further develop in the coming years, because we see in the same way the European Union is trying to develop these more strategic kind of transformative policy frameworks that kind of provide a vision and directionality for systemic change, that while there's ones focused on particular systems or particular areas, that we could see that there would be benefits in actually trying to do this for knowledge as well, and really trying to think about what a knowledge system for sustainability would look like. And in doing that, because you would be providing a framing and a direction that shapes practices, funding, all of these things, it needs to be something that's done with stakeholders. It's not something that should just be done by, you know, a smaller group of people. So this is an area of work that we want to explore, and this is why this workshop session and getting your views and stuff is going to be quite helpful to us. So I really just want to thank you for taking the time to engage with us, to have these discussions, because we will try to take this away, we make some sense of it, sense out of all these different contributions, and then we can feed that into and strengthen our thinking about what a future knowledge system for sustainability could look like. And as I said, in doing this, in the progressing this work in the coming years, we would definitely want to continue these types of interactions. And so who knows, we may be back in contact in some shape or form, or in a different conference setting, because I see you're also wanting to keep this conference setting going in some way. With a new kind of knowledge architecture, so we would like to engage in that. So I don't know, Tom, Gary, if you want to say any last things as well.
No, I was going to do that. Yeah, that context setting, Kathy. Thanks. I'll hand over to Gary just to wrap up. But yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, within the UK, obviously we're no longer part of the European Union, so we're very interested in observing what goes on elsewhere and see how we can learn from that. We are considering, for instance, within the UK, the evolution of our own participation of what one, you know, within the European Environment Agency, and that maybe those kind of conversations can proceed. And certainly from within my own institution, we are hugely looking to transform our own knowledge system. And similarly in the academic institution where I have a visiting professorship at Surrey University, we're very much looking about how the university itself can become a much more sustainability oriented organization. So this, again, thinking about those as microcosms of the knowledge system we're talking about. So these insights can be hugely valuable. So thank you to everybody for their participation today, and let's hope this is the start of a conversation, and look forward to participating in it further. Can I say thank you to the conference organisers and to Francisco for enabling us and making sure the tech worked properly, and thank you to Diana for kicking us off. Yeah, I wish you all a very pleasant rest of your days, yeah, thank you once again.